Hi all, and welcome to this discussion of research data management and high performance computing. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you here today. Bienvenue et merci pour l'opportunité de vous parler aujourd'hui. Let me start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from Kingston, Ontario, which is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge that along with a lot of research and reading, I have benefited greatly from the insights and advice of many patient individuals from across Ontario HPC community, the Alliance, and folks as far away as British Columbia. You know who you are, and I thank you. Here's what we'll be covering today. We'll have a brief introduction to research data management and its importance in the HPC-based research world, a review of the RDM life cycle and its intersection with HPC, a section on managing your data, and a look at gaps in the ecosystem. And to ensure that I get through all of my slides, we'll be taking questions at the end. Please do take note of any comments or questions you may have as we work our way through these slides. Throughout the presentation, you'll hear me use both HPC and ARC interchangeably. And I just want you to know that I'm not making a differentiation, even if there actually may be one technically. So what is research data management? Well, you're all familiar with traditional scholarly outputs like journal articles. Research data management goes below the surface, ensuring that the data, metadata, and code and the scripts underpinning scholarly research are well managed and available for future use. And while there may be differences between research using big data and high performance computing and research using smaller data and laptops, from the perspective of RDM, there is no difference. Research data management issues of common interest include planning, documentation, backups, licensing, access, and ethics. Challenges that are perhaps more particular to high-performance computing include the questions of file sizes, numbers of files, computing power, and cost. Ultimately, though, regardless of the size of your data or the power of your computing, it's still a good idea to manage your data well. And fundamentally, it's just research, whether it's running on a lab bench with test tubes and beakers or running on high-performance computers. The key is having good data documentation at every stage. The article Challenges of Research Data Management for High-Performance Computing discusses big data in the context of high-performance computing. And it focuses on 4 of the well-known V's related to working with big data: volume, variety, velocity, and veracity. And focuses in particular on volume and variety. The authors note that in the field of HPC, data storage needs outpace growth in computing power, with this article estimating that for each additional unit of main memory on a given computer system, 35 units of data are generated, data in need of storage and management. In time, this growth is expected to become exponential. Additionally, this article notes that the impact of variety in data types and formats and the need to address data privacy and openness as major issues for HPC. A metadata-focused article in the Journal of Supercomputing speaks to the metadata gap in HPC in rather dramatic fashion, stating the deluge of dark data is about to happen. It goes on to say that lacking data management capabilities and missing data documentation constitute a major source of dark data, and dark data are caused by missing metadata. Underpinning this presentation are a number of fundamental needs that must be met to better serve HPC researchers and those who support them in Canada. These include fulfilling journal and funder requirements, which in the case of the Canadian tri-agencies includes institutional RDM strategies, and for researchers themselves, the requirement to create data management plans and to deposit data into a recognized data repository. Additionally, there is a need to maintain awareness of evolving ARC and RDM technologies and capacities, need to develop and convey general RDM best practices and advice, as well as ARC-specific best practices and advice, and identifying and addressing gaps in our ability to make data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Turning now to the RDM life cycle. To better understand how we can actually make data fair, it is useful to look at the research data lifecycle. This will highlight not only the stages of research, but also the types of data storage implicit with each stage, something that I think is important for us to have a shared understanding of, particularly as we look at the intersections between RDM and ARC. This review of the lifecycle will also show where researcher-facing requirements of the tri-agency RDM policy fit in. And I do recognize that this is a rather idealized model for research, and that real research tends to be a bit less organized than this model depicts. But we carry on. So to help introduce order to the research process and to ultimately improve the quality of research, the tri-agencies are asking researchers to think about various stages and aspects of the research in advance and to document these in a data management plan. These plans are not intended as a checkbox exercise with the sole goal of obtaining funding. Rather, these plans need to be considered as living documents, revisited and updated throughout the research project to reflect the shifting reality of how a project is unfolding. To help researchers, the Alliance has provided the DMP Assistant, an online, bilingual, easy-to-use tool that helps researchers write their data management plans. The DMP Assistant walks researchers through a series of questions grouped into 7 sections, shown here, each dealing with different stages or aspects of the research process, from data collection and documentation right through to ethics and legal requirements. In that article I mentioned earlier, Challenges of Research Data Management for High-Performance Computing, it identifies the need for DMPs, describing them as formal documents that specify how research data will be handled during and after a research project, and stating that all persons involved in HPC-based research have to negotiate on a DMP. It is interesting to note that the planning steps described in this article align remarkably well with the sections of the DMP Assistant. To further help HPC researchers in writing DMPs, the Alliance has provided a range of discipline-specific DMP templates tailored to meet the planning needs of diverse types of research, including one for advanced research computing. In addition, the Alliance team has provided a series of discipline-specific DMP exemplars, high-quality, vetted DMPs that researchers can consult to see what a good data management plan looks like, and among these is an HPC-specific exemplar. Next, the researchers turn to creating, obtaining, collecting, or deriving data. Then they process their data. And so, for example, we have perhaps cameras on an autonomous car capturing data at 30 frames per second and 16 frames per second. Data processing might involve distilling and standardizing these data before analysis. And then researchers conduct whatever analysis is required to respond to the research questions at hand. Together, these activities take place using active storage, specific to the process of conducting research. Next, we turn to dissemination. At this stage, researchers should seek to deposit their final research data into a recognized repository to support discovery and access, with data deposit being a requirement of the tri-agency RDM policy. The Alliance supports 2 national multidisciplinary repositories, the Federated Research Data Repository, or FERDR, and the Scholars Portal-run Borealis Data Repository, which provides instances of the well-established open source Dataverse repository platform to universities and colleges across Canada. In addition, researchers can find other repository options using the Re3 data inventory of data repositories. And to support discovery and access, the Alliance will soon be launching a new one-stop search portal called Lunaris, which will index the contents of these and other Canadian data repositories. Then we turn to preservation storage, which differs from repository storage, and that it is not intended for discovery and access, but rather serves as a long-term placement of data in preservation-friendly format, serving solely as a copy of last resort. Finally, we arrive at reuse of research data, which, as already mentioned, is supported by search portals like Lunaris where researchers can discover data and then be directed to repositories like Furter and Borealis and others, where the data actually live. Together, active, repository, and preservation storage make up the data storage continuum. Looking at this continuum from the perspective of normal or small data computing, we have active storage taking place using laptops, local networks, or lightweight cloud storage. We have repository storage using the repository options already discussed. We have preservation storage options, such as the Ontario Library Research Cloud, purpose-built to store data for the long term. If we now look at high-performance computing, we see a range of HPC storage types coming into play at the active storage stage of research, including home, scratch, project, and temp storage, presented to researchers in the form of folders that they have access to on their HPC system of choice. For this discussion, repository storage options already discussed can come into play. And we have SciNet providing preservation storage in collaboration with the Alliance's Furter team. So there are similarities and differences between storage in normal and HPC computing contexts. Let's zoom in on the HPC storage types. Home is personal storage space with a small quota, slower read-write speeds, and it's good for source code, small parameter files, and job submission scripts. Scratch is short-term storage suited for intensive read-write operations on larger files, is not backed up, and is periodically purged. This is good for checkpoint files, output from jobs, and other data that can be easily recreated. Project provides larger storage quotas in a PI's name, good for sharing. It's suited for large, fairly static data sets or material that is costly or difficult to be reacquired or regenerated. And finally, temp provides ephemeral but fast local storage used while a job is running. Contents are deleted when the job ends. In addition, we have high-capacity nearline storage, which is provided using automated tape libraries. Looking at HPC sites across Canada, we have Cedar at Simon Fraser, Graham at Waterloo under SharkNet, Beluga and Narwhal at McGill, and Niagara at U of T under SciNet. The takeaway here is that all of these systems have very similar baseline storage spaces like what I've just described. And looking briefly at storage space characteristics, we see that performance and cost go down as you progress through this types of storage, while capacity and durability go up. So let's turn our attention now to managing data, in particular in the HPC context. There are several things you can do to manage your data in both HPC and non-HPC contexts. Things like naming your files properly, organizing folders effectively, describing data sets appropriately, and choosing the right metadata standard. I won't go into the details shown here for each of these here today due to time constraints, but suffice to say that you should document the heck out of your research and include things like metadata, code, scripts, software used, and dependencies, as well as dataset versioning. And all of this, if you do it well, will be in support of eventual data reuse. So let's go back to the HPC storage types and look at where and how to manage your research data. For the sake of this discussion, let's assume that the project directory is a logical place to start with for managing your data in the HPC context. And in this space, I propose working with some variation of these three folders: raw data, intermediate data, and final data, with raw data containing original, unprocessed research data collected or obtained, intermediate containing processed, normalized, transformed, and or linked data analyzed and used to conduct research, and final data containing cleaned, documented, ready to deposit data, ultimately used to arrive at research results and conclusions. I've had it pointed out to me, however, that HPC is not necessarily used for every stage of data processing and analysis, as this might have suggested. This came out of a conversation with Michael Bauer from SharkNet, who helped me articulate this more clearly through, though my Zoom whiteboard skills do not do our conversation justice. So here's a hopefully cleaner rendering of our thoughts. Looking at computing needs ranging from small to large, and size of data ranging from small to large, we can envision researchers with small data sets and small computing needs using laptops or similar computing systems to conduct their research. Those with medium-sized data sets and moderately higher computing needs may opt to use either high-end laptops or computers or more powerful HPC computing resources. And those with big data and big computing needs will use HPC resources or the cloud. Bringing home one of the points of this exercise, we can look at the long tail of research data, where you have lots of researchers with small data, but potentially varying computing needs. So this visual shows that we have relatively few big data sets compared to the number of smaller data sets that make up the long tail in this diagram. And while the vast majority of data sets are smaller in size, some of them do require HPC scale computing power. So as an example of this, small data, large computing use case is when working with Monte Carlo simulations. So while data sets associated with these simulations can be relatively small, the computational costs can be staggeringly high. If we turn to machine learning and AI or genomic research, we're dealing with large data sets and large computing needs. This is certainly the realm of big data. And to close the loop, we generally don't see use cases where very large data sets are processed on a laptop. If we introduce the previously proposed RDM organizational structure, the raw, intermediate, and final folders, into this discussion, not all of these stages of research data from raw, intermediate, and final need necessarily be run on HPC. We could, for instance, see raw data processed on HPC, while intermediate data get processed and or analyzed on smaller computing platforms. Conversely, raw data may be processed on small computing with subsequent analysis of intermediate data taking place on more powerful computers up to and including HPC. Moving on to final data that we'd like to see deposited for potential discovery and access by others, we can see that the size of these final data sets can be small or quite large. All of this has implications for both the HPC and storage needs of researchers, as well as for the research data management efforts. As we described from the outset, everything hinges on good metadata, describing the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your research. And good metadata typically includes things like high-level information about the study, data-level descriptions, other contextual information in support of reuse, including things like research methodology, variable definitions, classification systems, all the way through to annotation of relevant software used. Metadata takes several forms, including those shown here. Let's start with Readme files, which I have the impression are among the most used forms of metadata in some disciplines. In recognition of this reality, Cornell University has produced an excellent guide to writing Readme-style metadata, covering topics like general information, data and file overview, sharing and access, and methodological information, as well as data-specific information. So here are some highlights of this guide for each heading, and the guide provides much more. We won't take the time now to go through these in terrible detail, but certainly we've got things like dataset title, short description of what each file contains, licensing, methods of data collection, and so on, and a variable list containing names and definitions of column headings, and so on. In a conversation we had as I prepared for this talk, Danny Gruner from Cynet described Readme files as being a poor man's metadata that may lack the necessary parts and doesn't always work that well. So let's next take a look at data dictionaries and codebooks. Data dictionaries are most often used for tabular data and include names and descriptions of various tables, their contents, and types and lengths of each data element and any relationships that may exist between tables. Codebooks are richer in scope and content and often themselves include data dictionaries. And let's turn now to metadata standards. The IHSN technical note on metadata standards highlights several benefits of using metadata standards. Metadata standards help overcome the content but chaos of Readme files. They improve upon the semi-imposed organization and content of data dictionaries and codebooks, which are designed primarily for human use. And ultimately, the use of metadata standards imposes a clear structure that lends itself to machine actionability, interoperability, and a range of associated benefits. And just to go quickly through some of these benefits, we have things like detailed machine actionable documentation easily converted into other documents or web pages. We have quality supporting quality checking, improving discovery and automation of error-prone manual processes. We have greatly facilitated reuse and fostering collaborative efforts to enhance and extend reusability while reducing costs and maintaining transparency. They overcome the limitations of proprietary formats. Standards enable automation of simple or repetitive tasks, resulting in higher quality and more timely data. Standardization also facilitates data linkage and harmonization, which is a huge thing in research these days. And finally, they support data validation, reuse, and attribution. Again, very important for researchers to be thinking about as they seek tenure and promotion. So all of these speak to the overarching value of finding and applying appropriate metadata standards to your data. And they ensure the presence and placement of all the right parts so that your data runs smoothly in the ecosystem. In addition, metadata standards facilitate crosswalks, and software crosswalks allow data in one metadata format to be mapped or converted to another. This flexibility is key to the metadata harvesting undertaken by Lunaris, which consolidates metadata from a diverse range of data repositories to provide one-stop searching for Canadian researchers. So Lunaris harvests metadata from FERDR and from Borealis, along with a range of other disciplinary and open data portals. And it indexes currently over 100,000 repositories, points to over 80,000 data sets, and is a huge driver of data reuse in Canada. Circling back to our earlier managing your data slide, I will admit to skipping the last item on this list, choosing an appropriate metadata standard. So if we look at that now, you can find an appropriate metadata standard by a number of means. One of them is the Texas Tech's MetaRater, which inventories metadata standards by discipline. In a very similar fashion, we have the Research Data Alliance has metadata standards organized by subject, and you can see a number of different subjects listed there. And the Digital Curation Center as well has a number of metadata standards organized by subject. And I've just flagged biology here because that's where I come from originally. And there are a number of metadata standards that one would use if you're in the biological sciences. So let's revisit the research data life cycle and look what typically happens today in a research workflow. We have researchers creating data and processing it, analyzing it, and then disseminating it, and resulting, perhaps if they're fortunate and the research is good, they get a publication, and then the project ends. The research data themselves that are analyzed may find their way into personal files, but ultimately, because we've seen this happen so many times, they end up in the trash. And we in the RDM world want to see this avoided. So we do not want to see data end up in the trash as researchers retire or as computers go defunct and get thrown out and so on. So ideally, we'd like to see this kind of workflow, starting with the creation of a data management plan at the outset, then going through the creation of data, processing, analyzing, disseminating, and publishing. But then seeing those data and metadata deposited into an RDM system or a repository, including those that we've discussed already, and then being, the end of the project may come at around that point, and then the data and metadata would be harvested by a search engine like Lunaris, and then we have effective reuse, and that's one of our goals here in this idealized data management workflow. So let's turn our attention now to gaps. Starting with the conceptual recap of what we've covered so far, we have researchers at a university or college setting up research projects that involve data generated, collected or obtained, and analyzed on local storage using local computing resources. Final data are then deposited into recognized repositories such as Furter, Borealis, or others. Data are harvested into Lunaris for discovery and reuse. And I'm introducing the concept of PIDs, or persistent identifiers, here as sort of a glue that holds all of this together. And I just attended a JISC-sponsored webinar earlier this morning that was highlighting the incredible importance of persistent identifiers like DOIs, ORCID IDs, research organization registries, and so on to this ecosystem. And all of this leads ultimately to making research data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Into this mix, we've introduced the HPC ARC considerations that we've discussed so far. And so what I'd like to do is relate this back, at least initially in the list of gaps, to the HPC storage types that we discussed earlier. And one of the first gaps we came up with is the need for policy-based protocols to trigger automated transfer of data from hot storage to cooler storage and beyond. And it's not to say that researchers shouldn't be doing this and aren't doing some of this, but when they don't, there should be some sort of a process that ensures that these resources are being used effectively and not wasted. There are a couple of gaps that relate back to the big data diagram we started with this talk with, namely the need for scalability for discovery and reuse. The volume of data we're talking about requires efficient indexing and searching of potentially millions of data objects, and overcoming challenges related to moving data around. Second, there's a need for the solutions to handle sensitive data, and while not unique to HPC, it's certainly something that we have to consider in that space as well. Next, we need more HPC scale big data preservation solutions contributing to a robust network of preservation service providers for Canadian research data. So adding to the OLRC and SciNet solutions. And I know that the Alliance is working on building out that preservation service provider network. We need easy to use metadata authoring tools that pave the way for implementing metadata standards. The act of depositing data into either Furter or Borealis automatically generates standards compliant metadata, but more work needs to be done in this space to make sure that researchers have an easy path to applying appropriate metadata standards. We need, or perhaps I should say more accurately, I need to understand cloud computing better and how to manage data better in the cloud, both commercial and community cloud instances. We need to continue to build our understanding of and address challenges associated with Indigenous data sovereignty as they relate to ARC and HPC. And this too is an ongoing conversation. And we need to provide more help in writing data management plans, including targeted training and more exemplars and templates. So if any of you are interested in contributing to that, I'm sure the Alliance would be very happy to hear from you. And we have a need for more targeted HP-specific RDM support and training, including, among other things, writing, documenting, and depositing efficient code for reuse and replicability. And by way of example, my daughter wrote code to analyze data using tens of thousands of iterations. For debugging purposes, she included a line of code that wrote intermediate outputs to a file. And while this was incredibly useful for getting things working properly and debugging her program, inadvertently leaving this code in live for the production run increased computing demands by orders of magnitude. So documenting this particular line of code and other things within her scripts will certainly make her code more easily understandable and reusable by others. And since we're talking about big data, machine learning and the like, I thought I'd have a bit of fun and perhaps it's even fitting that we seek validation from our emerging and hopefully benign supercomputer overlord. So I asked ChatGPT, which most of you are probably familiar with, what are some of the challenges of managing data on high performance computing platforms? And right out of the gate, came back with data transfer and storage, data management, data integrity and security, data visualization, and scalability. So I'll give low marks to ChatGPT for suggesting data management as one of the challenges of managing data. It seems a little bit circular to me, but the other suggestions aren't that far off the mark. They're not terribly nuanced, but there they are. So turning back to human ideas and human creativity, the challenges of RDM for HPC article I've used throughout this presentation proposes an RDM-friendly architecture for HPC, starting off with a storage layer, which stores only data. The storage layer has to be a cost-effective, extendable mass storage system on which an object management system can be built. The object layer contains data about the data, so metadata, including where it is located in the storage layer. And finally, a user layer, which provides flexible interface for supporting browsing, searching, depositing, and manipulating data objects in the research data management system. And it also supports and facilitates creating, adding, and augmenting metadata and linking it to the storage layer. So under this model, data stays put in an appropriate storage location. Metadata lives anywhere it's needed. And users have a convenient and easy to use way of depositing data for discovery and reuse. And when they find data, they get pointed back to where the data lives and have a means of accessing and potentially analyzing data in situ. So looking at my progress to date, the tip of the iceberg represents what I've learned so far, but I still have a heck of a lot to learn. And in closing, I'm keen to hear from any of you who may have insights on how we can better incorporate RDM best practices into HPC workflows. So I want to thank you for your attention. And I would also like to just acknowledge a range of sources that I've made use of.